Hi. My name's Judith Resnick. I'm the Arthur Lyman Professor of Law at Yale Law School. We, the Lyman Center, along with Dwayne Betts, the Lyman Center being Jennifer Taylor, shout out here, who's here. There's a report about us, and if anybody wants to know more than I wish we had to tell you about solitary confinement, there's a report called Time in Cell just out about more than 50,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States. So we, Freedom Reads, Peter, Diane, Whitney, Humanities Plus, are all very glad that you're all here. I was at the law school right now. There's another conference called Access and Accountability, run by the what is called the Mafia, the Media Freedom of Information Clinic. And I wish that all 60 of those people could be also sitting here. And I did pitch, please think about and talk about and write about, and thank goodness you do some, the state of incarceration. I'm going to start by introducing some of the themes of the panel and our discussion with a little bit of pictorial and text, while also, and then thereafter, each of our panelists is going to speak in the order in which they're seated, actually. Elizabeth Hinton, and I'm not going to, I think everybody's bios are available, so I'm not going to talk about who they are because you're going to listen to them rather than me talk about them. And Echo Yannick and Zachary Lazar, sorry. I was going to, there's a law school person who has a name, anyway. And Tracy Mears. I was going to add, alter names. But I want to start by talking about the degree to which incarceration has been very visible, is very visible, and has been for centuries as a practice, that it is visible to those in and outside of prisons for any of the many public minds or eyes who want to look or who care to look. And not only that, but the fact of incarceration has been for a long term advertised as well as debated, and the practices of incarceration and the practices of punishment are here. And I want to invite, because it's a wonderful audience, to think about the range of texts and materials that are available. So assuming there, I'm in Amsterdam in the 1780s. The population is declining. And there is a folio, which, thank you, the Beinecke, and I also need to advertise that there's an exhibit at the Beinecke and an exhibit at the law school on some images that you can go see, and I have some handouts for that. So this image is one of about 100 in a folio put together to tell you, move to Amsterdam, it's a great town. 20% of the images are about how they detain people, either in orphanages, poor people, and this is the Men's House of Correction, which is the largest of the buildings of that era being built, and this is the ad. This is not anything covert whatsoever. And when you go inside, and thank you, Bernard Harcourt, because this one's in the color image is fabulous, you're watching somebody being flogged. And this is the ad. We keep control, we're very tidy, we're neat, we make you do menial work, and we whip you if you don't behave. Move to Amsterdam. Okay. Now, as, of course, the invention of the penitentiary comes, of course, starts to be some concerns. So not all the visuals look like this, and if you go to the British Yale Center for British Art, you'll find this, which is a print after a painting by Thomas Ryder of The Captive. The Brits are depicting someone in a French prison, get the Channel fight, and it's pointing to this kind of saintly, chained prisoner to start the call for reform. And across the continent and then across the oceans, and this is Europe and the United States, not all the world by any stretch of the imagination, although there's a colonial piece, the efforts at religious societies to reform, improve the lot of prisoners ramps up with the founding of social sciences, of sociology and anthropology, and this thing called criminology. And the next stop is now a plaque that was put up in 1970, but it commemorates in 1870 the first ever National Congressional Congress, where the people who were the prison men met with Rutherford B. Hayes, welcoming them as the governor before he became president of Ohio, to say, welcome to these organizations that are committed to figuring out how to run and reform prisons. And unlike the early part of the 1800s, when we really wanted menial work, now we're into reformation and useful work, some of it, of course, hugely profit-making for the people who were doing it. They talk, they debate. You can read, I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of their materials. How you punish, which way you punish, do you crook, do you frog, da, da, da. And here's an example from a British prison of 1902, and you're looking at a disgusting practice called what they called a tread wheel. Men being made to go circle 7 steps over and over and over again. While this is all displayed, available, seeable, maybe for a deterrent. Jeremy Bentham wanted you all to be scared and not do this, so he wanted the panopticon. So this is the 1920s. This is a painting of Marjorie Fry. Part of it is that in a world of gender stories, this gender story needs to include that there are reformers, some of whom are women, some of whom are feminists, and Fry and her colleagues of the Howard League in London are the first speakers I've found in a variety of documents that say the word rights and torture. Prison is torture and people deserve rights, and there should be an international convention. And the guys who are by then running the International Penal Penitentiary Commission poo-poo the ladies, they call them the ladies, and say get rid of them. But these are incredibly entrepreneurial, smart women who go to Geneva and lobby the League of Nations with these amazing anti-death penalty, pro-convention for the rights of prisoners, their words, and therefore the guys at this international organization, which is full of countries that are empires, say we better draft rules, and the women convince the men who draft rules. And for the first time in 1935, the League of Nations adopts the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, which you see are from a humanitarian point of view and a social point of view. And what their rules are just give you heartburn in terms of how awful prisons are. So there should be enough food, i.e. there wasn't enough food. There should be enough water, etc. Corporal punishment is generally not acceptable, except in exceptional cases if a medical person authorizes it. That is because the Brits love whipping. It isn't just Amsterdam and it isn't just elsewhere. The Brits and the British colonies have flogging, birching, and whipping a lot. And in exceptional cases, a dark cell, if regulated by law, i.e. a dungeon, is also permissible as well. These rules are disseminated. This is a frontispiece from the Home Office with the Queen's seal, which tells you that we're sending them around to everyone. And then World War II comes. This organization, international organization, actually meets in Berlin in the 1930s because if prisoners have no rights, because the UN did not, the League of Nations had no language of rights, then fascist, whatever your government is, we can make things together to manage the folks we are keeping in detention. But when you get to the United Nations in 1955, although these are not enforceable, the new words come in a world of rights, non-discrimination, and the person has a right to self-determination and liberty. But then there's the sad caveat, unless we need to do something to control and manage you. And if you go through some of their rights, we are now, discipline is needed. We're banning corporal punishment. There's no longer a dark cell. But here's what we tolerate. We tolerate reduced diet as a euphemism for bread and water, and we tolerate solitary confinement if it's certified that you can stand it. Now, if, of course, in the United States and elsewhere in the world, in terms of colonial imperialism, of course, the centrality of race in this story. So there are many pioneers in the United States in the 1960s who are individual prisoners who believe that law will help them. And they look at the U.S. Constitution and they say, law can help me. And in doing this, this is Caleb Washington. And the case is called Washington v. Lee, not George Washington versus Robert E., although the people who styled the complaint knew exactly what they were doing. Alabama had a statute that said segregation by race meant that black and white people couldn't be chained together or sleep together in prison. A lawsuit challenging this in 1966 wins in the lower courts, and in the U.S. Supreme Court, they bring what they call a statement of questions, and the question they raise, this is 1967 in the United States, and these people have the Yiddish word as chutzpah to say, does a prisoner serving a penitentiary sentence have a constitutional right to question the validity of state statutes requiring separation by race, which is to tell you the status of the person was claimed to be not a person who had any relationship to the U.S. Constitution once it was you were convicted. And by the way, this is the first term that Thurgood Marshall is sitting in the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the first time it's not an all-white institution itself. So just to be quickly summarizing, first of all, it's a very very visible activity. There are debates about permissible and impermissible, and the people who are the serious speakers of the claim for a constraint on sovereign power are the folks who are incarcerated who say you can't treat me like this. And the answer from Justices Black, the court says, yes, you can't segregate by race, except comes a concurrence. If there are racial tensions, you can take them in account to maintain security, discipline, and good order in prisons and jails. That's the mantra. Maintain security, discipline, and good order. So here come to Arkansas in 1967, and this is a picture in the newspaper. Thank goodness for newspapers. And the newspaper says, this is the whip. Arkansas says to maintain good order, we whip prisoners. And Winston Talley is a guy who says in this handwritten petition, please, people writing, look at the literature produced by the people who are in detention, handwriting in a variety of ways, not only to courts, but to courts included. WHIP, W-H-I-P-P, no evidence this is a man who's part of, learned some about him, that he's part of a social movement, but he understands himself. He says, Article 8, you can't whip me. And he gets a hearing in federal court. This is the group of people who are testifying, as Arkansas has about 60% white prisoners and is whipping black and white people together. Now, of course, while these people may or may not be part of movements, there is, of course, a huge social movement of which the Attica picture is one example. The Nation of Islam is organizing in prisons as well. And there's an effort at what is profound and serious claims that of the capacity of the state to require the state to not punish people in particular ways. And you get for a little while federal judges saying, here's in the Fifth Circuit with Louisiana, Angola, we are here. The Constitution's here. You're in relationship to the Constitution. You're us as well. But as is sadly familiar to many of you, by the 1980s, we're not here very much. And the new floor of what is tolerable constitutionally is minimal civilized measure of life's necessities. A pathetic floor for this whole thing. And here, just to bring you to date, in 2008 in California, you have hyperdensity, which everybody, there's actually, the word used to be called crowding. Overcrowding is a weird word that gets added. But if you go to the 1970s and 80s, they call it crowding. So overcrowding is here. And anybody who wants to look at its harms, the Department of Justice, this is the document that's out that is kind of a trigger warning. It's horrible to read about Alabama state prisons. And of course, it's appropriate to invoke them because the prisoners have just gone on strike there in protest. You can read pages of this. So it's not secret. There's contestation about it. And the question about what is permissible in a social order brings me to the last image, which is by Faith Ringgold, called The United States of Attica, marking the violence that is incomplete. The last sentence at the bottom, which is hard to read, says, this map of American violence is incomplete. Please write in whatever you find lacking. Seems to me she is the words to be the introduction to the people who are coming to speak, and I'm incredibly grateful that they've come and are here and are going to talk to us about the problems of this, which they can do either standing up or sitting, depending on their backs and their spines. Go for it. Elizabeth, you're next. Whatever you want.
I'm going to sit, I think.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you for that. And thank you to the Whitney Humanities Center, Freedom Reads, the Lyman Center, and of course, the organizers, Judith Resnick, Dwayne Betts, Jenny Carroll, and Peter Brooks, for inviting me to join this conversation, and all of you for coming. So, picking up on this slide, this is actually like the perfect segue. I want to think about the image of the prison in the public mind in the era of rebellion, what could be seen as the kind of opening act of mass incarceration. Because immediately after the long, hot summers of the late 1960s and early 1970s, people of color and black people in particular start getting disproportionately and systematically locked up, right? And mass incarceration as we know it begins. So what I call the crucible period of rebellion lasted from 1964 to 1972. And every major city burned during these 8 years, as well as mid-sized and smaller cities and rural towns across the United States, the East and West, from the North and South, the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, leading to nearly 3,000 incidents in total across more than 1,000 segregated communities of color. Now, nearly all of these rebellions were sparked by a police encounter, a moment of tangibly felt racism. Yet the tens of thousands of Black and brown people who threw rocks and bottles at police, plundered local stores, detonated Molotov cocktails, were rebelling not just against police brutality, right? They were rebelling against a broader system that had entrenched unequal conditions and anti-Black violence over generations. So the so-called riots constituted a set of demand for jobs, first and foremost, expanded educational opportunities, better housing conditions, and an end to state-sanctioned violence. These, of course, were the same demands as the civil rights movement more broadly, but policymakers treated the rebellions as criminal acts, as crime, not as calls for full economic and political inclusion in American society. So under the banner of the War on Crime, which President Lyndon Johnson started in the spring of 1965, the federal government supported the expansion of police in targeted Black, Puerto Rican, and Mexican-American communities, accompanied by the militarization of those police forces with an arsenal of surplus weapons and technologies from Vietnam and interventions in South America and the Caribbean. So the national solution, the counterinsurgency, was more police leading to more incarceration. And the effect was to place low-income families and their communities under the omnipresent gaze of police and to normalize confinement. Now, we often think of police brutality as being the proximate cause of the collective violence, as was the response most recently to the brutal murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, which sparked the nonviolent and violent protests that we witnessed during the summer of 2020. But the rebellions very often began in response to the specter of incarceration. People fought back when police exercised their most basic legal authority, making arrests. According to data calculated by the political scientist Christian Davenport at the University of Michigan's Radical Information Project, about 24% of the rebellions during the Crucible period began in response to an arrest or an attempted arrest that was seen in the minds of participants as arbitrary. The Watts Rebellion of 1965 and Newark in 1967, which, along with Detroit, of course, are kind of the iconic riots of the era in the public imagination, each began in response to the arrest of a Black motorist. People did not want to see their friends, family, and fellow community members handcuffed, detained, captured, removed from the community, thrown behind bars, and possibly sent to faraway prison. In Baltimore, Black residents challenged officers' arresting authority with determination, disrupting arrests on 3 separate occasions in late June 1968, about 2 months after the week-long rebellion that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King. On June 19th, after an officer tried to arrest a young man in the heart of the Black Upton neighborhood in front of a growing crowd, a woman scratched him down his left arm and took his watch. The officer sprayed the woman and others with mace, and the people who gathered at the scene left. Less than a week later, a 15-year-old boy grabbed an officer's arm during a disorderly conduct arrest, giving his suspect an opportunity to flee. The officer hit the boy and took him into custody. The next evening, 24 teenagers began shouting at officers Paul Karasavich and Norman Stamp as they attempted to arrest 3 people on burglary charges at around 11:30 in the Reservoir Hill neighborhood. A 13-year-old girl jumped on Stamp's back, forcing him to let go of 2 of the suspects, and the men escaped. So Officer Stamp seized the girl, who kicked him, clawed him, and bit him. Eventually, Stamp managed to put the girl in handcuffs for resisting arrest, but suddenly, her 14-year-old brother attacked the officer from behind. And after a struggle, the brother was also detained. Another 14-year-old boy helped free the 3rd burglary suspect by assaulting Karasavich. The suspects, all 3 of them young men, escaped, and the kids who came to their defense went to jail. Viewing the arrests as an injustice and the potential to be incarcerated as an injustice, these young people were willing to take justice into their own hands and sacrifice their own freedom in the process. Although the informal arrest prevention campaign in Baltimore did not directly inspire a broad rebellion, in other cities, a single arrest could lead to sustained collective violence committed by hundreds of people. For example, in Jersey City in August 1970, about 500 Black and Puerto Rican residents declared what police called open warfare on whites in the downtown area after two patrolmen stopped a vehicle for a minor traffic violation. Weeks later, in nearby Hoboken, a 6-hour-long drug raid during which 25 people were arrested caused a two-night rebellion. The prominent 21-year-old activist Luis Lopez came to protest the mass arrest and was subsequently arrested himself for interfering with police duties and using obscene language. By 7:30 p.m., 300 to 400 enraged Puerto Ricans, as the Hudson Post-Dispatch described them, surrounded City Hall demanding Lopez's release. About 30 people sat at the intersection of Washington and First to block traffic. The crowd threw rocks and bottles at police and smashed windows in the area. Lopez continued to protest the arrest of Puerto Rican residents in Hoboken, leading to another rebellion a year later. It started with an angry confrontation between Luis and Jamie Santana, aged 26 and 24, and a store owner whom the brothers claimed repossessed their television set under false pretenses. After the Santana brothers were arrested for assault with a dangerous weapon, Lopez led a small group of activists to police headquarters to demand the release of the prisoners and to request the suspension of the two officers who allegedly used brutal force during the arrest. Soon after Lopez and his group left, police reportedly received calls that people were harassing motorists and passersby outside of City Hall. And then when local officers arrived, a group of about 300 people began throwing cans, bottles, and bricks at them, and the rebellion spread from there. Seen as an unfair, unjust, and racist institution, the siblings in Baltimore, Luis Lopez and his defenders, and their counterparts in other cities, took the act of policing and the resulting incarceration as a form of state violence that could only be contested with further violence. The beginning of mass incarceration helped bring the crucible period of rebellion, the period of frequent community-based instinctive violence, to an end. The systematic imprisonment of young people of color that started in this era effectively removed from cities a significant portion of the young people who had committed and sustained the political violence. As such, by the mid-1970s, 75% of Black people in American prisons were under the age of 30. Although Black Americans have been disproportionately incarcerated since the Civil War, until the 1970s, they amounted to about a third of the nation's prison population. This changed in the mid-1970s when Black, Puerto Rican, and Central and South American groups began to approach majorities in state and federal prisons. The mass incarceration of Black and Brown Americans over the past half-century can be partly attributed to the socioeconomic conditions that lay at the root of the rebellions, and that became even worse as the decade wore on with the end of the war on poverty and the simultaneous escalation of the war on crime. The fires in Miami in 1980 and Los Angeles in 1992, of course, nationally televised moments of mass political violence that reached a truly unprecedented scale, are legacies of the historical trends that began in the late 1960s and at the dawn of mass incarceration. In both cases, people did not erupt in response to a specific incident of police brutality, but instead to groups of police officers who were acquitted despite undeniable evidence of abuse. In the LA case, the 89-second video of officers striking Rodney King with their feet and their billy clubs between 53 and 56 times, which of course was the first viral video of police brutality and the proof of police brutality and in the white public imagination, right, did not move the jury in Simi Valley to convict. By the time LA exploded, the prison population had exploded more than fivefold, from fewer than 200,000 people in 1970 to 1.1 million in 1990. And it would continue to explode during the Clinton administration with the 94 crime bill, cementing the United States as a country defined, in part at least, by mass incarceration. The violence in Cincinnati in 2001, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a handful of other cities during the Obama years and in the summer of 2020 occurred in reaction to exceptional incidents of police violence or police killings. There are no longer rebellions against everyday policing practices, against arrests and the specter of incarceration, a sign that the status quo has become accepted in many over-policed and underprotected communities, however bitterly. And in this sense, at least, national and local authorities won the war on crime. And yet, as long as the criminal legal system proves time and time again to function as a means to lock people of color and poor people away for long prison terms and to sanction police violence, rebellion remains a possibility. I'll end there. Thank you.
Let me excuse me. Let me join the chorus in thanking the organizers and our host of this terrific conference. I was speaking to Peter yesterday, and he said, "Oh, it's a great group. This thing will run itself." And I just pointed out to him that that's the kind of thing that great hosts, whether it be dinner parties or conferences, always say. They work incredibly hard behind the scenes to make things look like they run themselves, but they most certainly do not. And we are grateful for all your work. Let me also take a moment to thank you all for being here. My students have to sit in rooms and listen to me. So the voluntary engagement is very deeply appreciated. One of the things that's great about seeing, let me turn on my timer. Forgive me, as an academic, I really ought to turn on a timer, lest we be here all day. One of the great things about such a group gathering, given the title, is the engagement and belief that the public imagination matters greatly when we think and talk about mass incarceration. I think that need not be too long litigated here. That is to say, the public imagination, and in particular the public imagination when it comes to race and crime, I think is deeply important, or one might say when it comes to race at all. So from Black princes to Black princesses, whether it be the Black Panther or the Little Mermaid, to secular kings like the Obamas, it is striking to see how much images of Blackness in the public media stir instant passion, anger, and upset. And I think this is in no place more powerful than when it comes to the way in which race and crime are linked. So my core idea starts where many of you have already known, and where many of my interlocutors on this panel, in particular, the two people on our ends, three people, have engaged with for years. That is the by now well-known idea that one of the problems in our American imagination is the fusing of criminality and race. That is, in the very idea that a Black man is presumptively criminal. That work has been so deeply explored, I actually don't want to litigate much here. For those of you who are more interested or newer to that idea, I'm happy to recommend what are now countless really thoughtful pieces on it. What I want to instead speak about is the idea that how violence is visited on Black men is, in connection to Black men being presumptively criminal, considered a form of policing. And that's true whether it be by public or private individuals. That is to say, the most provocative way I put it is that embedded in so much of white history is a kind of innate view of white privilege as innate deputizing. So this is a set of ideas that I've been working on for a while. And indeed, I'll have to say the word deputizing came to me recently at a conference, actually, that we were sharing. And I hoped that it indeed, one of the things I want to test with you is whether it captures the idea about which I'm trying, the idea I'm trying to pin down. So what do I mean? Deputizing here is meant to specify a form of policing. And that is to say, deputization highlights a particular relationship between policing and violence. Here, unlike Tracy Muir's work, which recently has started exploring the wider use of our term policing, for those of you in the law schools here or elsewhere, the term police power is a deep and long historic legal term with the broadest of uses. That is to say, it is as much part of the police powers of New Haven that they have zoning laws as it is that they have actual police officers. But it is also true that that same breadth refracts through our moral and colloquial thinking as well. So we might talk about policing each other in the way we behave. One might say I police my children. It is, as far as we know, my main job. We might say we police each other's language, things like that. And I don't want to deny that policing itself, that is, who is allowed to police who, instantly invites hierarchy. So, for example, if Tracy Mears and I are having a fight over whether or not I should have cited some scholar, right? Whether we're policing academic norms, it is going to be contested whether or not a student can suddenly pipe up and say, Professor Yankee, you should have ... One might say, no. Professor Mears and I are having that debate. That is to say, there's hierarchy in policing. That is understood. But what I want to do is focus on policing in a more specific way. That is to say, policing is not just about norms, but in this case, I want to talk about policing as a form of justified deployment of norm guarding and sanctioning. Fair enough. But that when I speak about policing and deputization, I'm arguing that violence and policing are in this sense deeply connected, right? So I'm not just talking about the way we might police each other in our normal everyday behavior. Deputization is about the way we police each other through violence. And because violence is especially salient, deputization, the argument goes, has its own expression. So instead, I want to preserve the salience of potential violence, but I also want to disconnect it from formally authorized policing by the state. And that's what I mean by deputization. So far, everybody with me? All right. So deputization in this sense has existed for a long, long time. For those of you who are policing scholars, actually, better yet, for those of you who are not policing scholars, it's always hard for us to remember that policing is actually kind of a new phenomenon. That is, modern policing is only, I don't know, 160 years or something like this.
1867.
So that's Peel's London, right? So 140
Here.
here.
Yeah, Peel is before that.
I should do the math. You get the idea. One of the reasons I bring this up actually is when I teach Philosophy 101, when I rarely get to teach Philosophy 101, one of the interesting things about philosophy is that a bunch of things we teach students are so deeply captured in our moments, right? So we say things like, I don't know, let me give you a silly example. The sign of a just and authorized state power is monopoly over its borders, right? If you would go back 200 years ago, that would have been a fanciful idea. The state just didn't have the power. I mean, there weren't the technologies that we have now that you could. So too with policing. When we talk about the fact that a justified state has police, it's actually quite stunning for us to remember that police were quite a modern invention. Why do I say this? The point is, policing, if you go back only a century and a half ago, was often done by what we call hue and cry. That is, the justified constable, right, the police officer, would, if somebody was, the official idea was, if somebody was a felon caught in the act of a felon, could raise hue and cry. And that would just be simply to say to all law-abiding citizens, you are now deputies. Come with me and let's capture this felon. Right? So deputization is a quite powerful way in which policing has always occurred. So too, obviously, it has its links in Jim Crow South, where white people could be deputized at any time in order to enforce the law and violence against Negroes, especially escaped slaves before the Jim Crow period, and unruly Negroes afterwards. Right. More importantly, I want to point out that deputization was about that feeling continuing through our history. The license that white people had to feel, or got to feel, about their ability to enforce violence, both formal and informal, to keep black people in place. And that's true again and again, even in less formal ways in large swaths of the country. So I'm thinking, for example, during natural disasters and times of threat, when many white communities simply armed themselves to police areas with a firm understanding that their activities were not illegal vigilantism, but something like deputization. Here then, this of course was often done with the tacit approval of formal police, right? But here then is why I want to make the claim that deputization is important. This is a difference between a kind of mindset about deputization and a kind of mindset about ordinary violence, right? That is to say, deputization is the idea that one is not just justified in using violence, but that one is authorized. That is to say, one is, so to speak, made an arm of the state when one does this. So the examples, of course, are countless, but think of George Zimmerman, who very much deputized himself as a one-man neighborhood watch. Think of Ahmaud Arbery's killers, who are complicated in that they were former police officers, but when they see a black man jogging through the neighborhood, they simply raise hue and cry. They call their friend. They jump in a truck and decide they're going to capture Ahmaud Arbery. And they experience, at least in their reporting, his resistance to their asking him to stop as his resistance to their authorized power, right? That's a very different kind of thing than if you and I were engaged in violence against each other, to which I'll respond later, to which I'll return later. So too, Kyle Rittenhouse sees protesters in Philadelphia, and he goes and gets a long gun and decides that he's going to join, in his imagination, not, by the way, entirely unfounded, numbers of people who are simply going to impose order on their community through arms. And if less fatally, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, who are famous for having pointed guns at protesters marching by their home, again, because they felt they were authorized to. So what do I want to say about deputization? 2 points. One is that in this sense, deputization is an innate part of our white culture, right? It is the power to think of yourself as authorized to dispense violence as against black people, not in a way that does wrong, but in a way that makes you an arm of the state. And I want to say that this, of course, doesn't mean that violence itself is a new concept. That would be absurd, right? But deputization is a powerful concept, right? If Zachary and I are engaged in violence against each other, we understand ourselves to be engaged in extra-legal behavior and perhaps even illegal behavior. Of course, there are communities where this is more complicated. I want to make sure that's clear. There are communities where the state is sufficiently failing that people have long thought of their violence as authorized by the state. The mafia would be the most obvious example, right? A Cosa Nostra meant this thing of ours. The state was insufficiently protective, so we will authorize ourselves. But it is quite something to think of yourself as latently empowered to do that everywhere at any time. That is to say, rather than my thinking that when I hit Zach, I'm doing something wrong or something to be punished, or that he and I are just even dispensing cruelty against each other, to think that when I hit Zach, I'm authorized by the state, that his resistance is resistance to not just justified power. It's not self-defense. It's policing. It's authorized policing. And that, my claim is a powerful kind of thinking that black people have not had access to. And that changes black lives. That is to say that black people live in a world often, by the way, as an aside, I will say, even as I get passionate about this, I dislike speaking so broadly. It is obvious that people have different experiences, different places in the hierarchy of power and wealth. I don't mean to elide that. But what is true is that black people are aware that they live in a world where it's not just that violence can be visited on them. That's true of everybody. But that violence can be visited on them by people who feel themselves authorized to do so, right? I usually actually don't like to be very personal. I think there's a kind of worry that black scholars are asked to trade personality for credibility. But I will, in one moment, just point out, when my boys touch other people's cars, I am frightened. And my boys are children. I am frightened because they will not always be children. And it is not that people will respond to them wrongly, i.e., don't touch my car, I'm angry. It's that people will feel authorized to visit violence on them because they are presumptively criminal. That is the power of deputization that is different than the power of violence, right? That was not in my papers. Okay. The question with which I want to end is this. Recently, well, one question which I want to ask is, one meta question I want to ask is, does the idea of deputization add anything to the idea of black people as presumptively criminal and simple sort of, is this simply racist violence as such, or does the idea of deputization actually change the way we can think about this? That's a kind of first order question. But setting that aside, the other questions are, oh, my timers didn't beep. Then I'll really conclude. Setting that aside, what I want to say is I've recently been working on writings with Keith Humphreys at Stanford on the changing demographics of mass incarceration. In particular, as many of you know, we're in a particular moment of kind of left-right convergence on decarceration. And that has meant that the percentage of black prisoners is dropping relative to the percentage of white prisoners, indeed dropping faster. Part of this is kind of feature, not bug, i.e. when you use your criminal law system to imprison black people, if you affect your criminal law system, you'll free black people at a faster rate. What I want to think about is whether or not that has an effect of undermining or destabilizing the image of blacks as presumptively criminal, and whether that itself has the ability to undermine this white innate power of deputization, the ability of white people to police black people through violence. What I also want to know is, if this historical image of the black criminal can be combated to drain the idea of legitimization, what happens to the idea of deputization? So, for example, there is suggestive work currently on for felony murder, which I will not explain. But the way felony murder turns out is often used to punish people disproportionately. It is often used itself, not just disproportionate to their crime, but it's also often used in vastly racially disproportionate ways, right? So black people are prosecuted for felony murder in crimes that white people would not be prosecuted for. Interesting work has been recently done where audit studies have been done trying to sort out white names, black names, and Hispanic names to see what potential jurors would do. And interestingly, while white jurors were punished less under felony murder statutes, black jurors actually weren't punished that much more when jurors were made alert that these were black jurors. That is to say, they may be guarding themselves in this new era of thinking about race and mass incarceration. But Hispanic jurors were punished vastly out of disproportion. So the worry is, can we undermine racial thinking about crime sufficient to undermine deputization? Or the worry might be, do we simply push and hide it into other spaces where our guards aren't up? And these are the ideas that I'm starting to wrestle with. I will stop there.
Sitting or standing as you like.
I'm going to sit, I think. I'm going to see if this is
I think it works.
Does it work?
It was.
No, I've got two.
Take them both.
The microphone,
Yeah.
I'll take echoes. I know echoes worked. Let's see here. And I would like to echo Echo's thoughts about thanking everybody and thanking you for being here. Can you hear me all right?
a little louder would be good.
Okay. Try to be a little louder. I'm very interested in what Echo just said about deputization, the word deputization. And I think one of the things you asked is if feedback was positive or negative about the word. And I think it's a very potent one-word way to suggest a lot of things that we're talking about today. And I want to kind of go from there to loop back to some of the things we were talking about in the first session, which had to do, I think, with the imagination, the way incarcerated people are imagined, and in particular what fiction has to say about that. And if we think about some of what Echo just talked about, I think we're talking about something that Bernard was talking about earlier, which is the way that everything becomes fiction if you look at it clearly. The idea of deputizing yourself and viewing someone else who is a fellow citizen as someone who you are in charge of is an act of imagination. It's a negative act of imagination, but it's an act of imagination. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fiction, which is what I do. But I'm going to start by, I'll just read my presentation is what I think I'll do. All right. My friend, the Loyola University sociologist Marcus Kondakar, recently launched a website called The Visiting Room. The Visiting Room compiles videotape interviews he's done over the course of 5 years with men serving life at Angola Prison in Louisiana. Each of the videos is vividly unique and intimate. When I posted the site's link on my Facebook page, one of my friends responded, "I just started looking at these, but anyone who watches would see how basically normal and human these men are. And no possibility of parole. That's insane. That's evil." It's likely that some of my other friends who saw my post had first-hand experience of prison, and so would not be surprised by the men's stories. Of course, to understand that men serving life in prison are basically normal and human should not be surprising anyway. But for many people, prison is a purely imaginary space, a kind of blankness covered over by received ideas and images. I'm here as a novelist, and I've been interested for a long time in the question, what can fiction possibly do to address this problem of misrepresentation? We're a long way from Uncle Tom's Cabin or Turgenev's A Sportsman's Sketches, which played important roles in the movements to abolish slavery and serfdom. Fiction is no longer in a position to shift public policy. Perhaps what it can still do then is at least attempt to create better images in the way of the visiting room. I'd like to read a passage from my novel, The Apartment on Cali, Uruguay, and then talk a little bit about it. In this scene, the protagonist, Christopher Bell, is going to visit the brother of his deceased partner at a prison that is like Angola in Louisiana. The brother, Jesse, has a life sentence, but has received a favorable parole recommendation and has a chance of getting out in a year and a half, so he's in this sort of a limbo. Before the visit to the prison, Christopher Bell was attacked by one of his neighbors just as he was planning to leave the United States for Mexico. He's a painter. He gets assaulted by this kid who happens to slash his eye, which is an important part of the body if you're a painter. All right, I'll just read a little bit now. Jesse sat by himself at a table by the wall, wearing the jeans and white T-shirt of a convict, as he always said, not the street clothes he usually wore. The lighting was so bright I wasn't even sure it was him at first, and when he stood up, I realized I'd signaled this uncertainty. He had lost weight, his hair a little thin on top, gray strands in it, but his eyes were so clear that he looked younger than before, younger and older simultaneously, as if even the aging process got distorted by the climate of where he lived. He asked how my drive had been, and I told him fine, and then I remembered his old-fashioned solicitude, which meant he wasn't just asking. He'd considered the risks of the long drive and was glad I'd made it safely. I told him I was going to meet Arnie in a couple of days in Texas, a state I'd never seen. And he told me the state of Texas always brought to mind the life he wanted to live when he got out of here. A pickup truck, football on TV, hunting or fishing on the weekend, a family maybe, but maybe not. He pushed his chair closer to mine and said he wanted to look at my healed eye. He'd been studying anatomy since the attack in my living room. He'd told me this before, and he put his fingertip on my eyebrow now and leaned in closer. There were 6 muscles in the eyelid, he said, just in the lid itself, not the eye, which had its own very complicated musculature. When he blinked, the 6 muscles in each eye kicked into action simultaneously. Flash, 12 reflexes fired. Muscle tissue, nerve tissue, microscopic tissue. The blade was like a backhoe cutting through all that delicate tissue, he said, all the way down to the level of the synapses. It's amazing it healed, I said. He moved his chair back to the opposite side of the table. So I live in the country now, he said, sold the house, quit the job. I should have left a long time ago, I said. It's easy to see it now. It would have seemed ridiculous a few years ago. I went over to the booth out in the hall to order some food. Jesse got a double cheeseburger, a mammoth sandwich that dripped around his fingers and was hard to eat. I had a fish sandwich that was similar. The taste of the food, the difficulty of eating it, the solemnity of where we were, the fact that I'd paid. We were both trying not to think all these thoughts and both failing, thinking and eating in the silos of ourselves. He was involved with an old girlfriend from high school, he finally told me, a woman he hadn't seen or heard from in more than 20 years before she contacted him last fall. She'd started writing him letters, then emails, then talking to him on the phone and coming for visits. I knew from conversations we'd had in the past that people actually had sex in this visiting shed, with its gray linoleum floor and stifled gray light that made it feel underwater. Sometimes they managed to do it right at the table with their clothes on in front of the guards. There was a way to push the video games closer together to create a space that was hard to be seen in. That wasn't the kind of relationship Jesse described to me now, though. She was solid, he said. Down to earth. She could talk to him about the most boring things, the people she worked with, how none of the stores carried her kind of cigarettes anymore, some lipstick she found that tasted like cake, and he would listen intently. When you compared it to how they fought, he said it was like the sweet spot. Most of his life consisted of sleep, work call, eating, sleep. Listening to her talk about some argument with her sister, finding a way to take her side and argue for it sincerely, was like getting high. She put money on his commissary and paid for his cell phone. That was how they talked and texted and even flirted with each other in public on Facebook. He knew that the asshole she was living with wasn't listening to her, he said. All that daily life shit. If he was honest about it, he admitted, he probably wouldn't listen to it either if he was the other man. He knew this, but he couldn't really believe it because he was here, not there. It started to turn into this whole movie in his head, Jesse and Antonia, like he could hear the fucking soundtrack. I worried about the contraband cell phone, but didn't say anything. The institution had special tablet computers that enabled you to check your prison email and download music files, which cost more than ordinary ones, and I had bought Jesse one of these players and funded it every once in a while. But now this seemed quaint, inadequate. He was having a love affair with a real woman who wanted him to have a phone and who, Jesse told me, got angry if he didn't stay in touch with it. He said the relationship was almost as much as about arguing and strife as it was about happiness. They were drawn to each other, but always forgot they tended to argue and look for ways to hurt each other. They must both get off on it, he said, laughing. He told her she had to leave the other man. It was untenable. He was going to cut it off with her if she didn't get her own apartment, but actually he was just like that other man, he said. All threats and no follow-through. Masochism, he said, shaking his head. Is that what this is with me and her? I think it's just ordinary drama, I said. I had that kind of feeling with your sister sometimes. With Anna now. It's different, I said. Different movie, he said. Different soundtrack. When I tried to imagine his daily life, I would see gray, dark hours or lurid, violent ones. When I used to try to imagine his daily life, I would see gray, dark hours or lurid, violent ones instead of the textures and hues his eyes actually saw. I still couldn't see what he saw. I knew that. His equanimity was something I could never fathom. Okay, I'll leave. That's it for the fiction part, I promise you. Okay. To go back to my friend's comment on Facebook. Men serving life in prison are basically normal and human, my Facebook friend said. Fiction tries to enliven statements like that through mundane, trivial details that can transform abstractions like normal and human into felt realities. The anatomy of the eye, the messiness of the cheeseburger, the contraband cell phone. Like any art form, fiction has the potential to organize the world's infinite chaos of particles into a pattern. Though because fiction's medium is language, it always suggests meaning, or at least the possibility of meaning. This is what the Jewish tradition calls tikkun olam, or reconfiguring or repairing the world. My character Jesse contains particles of people I know or have met, but he is mostly imaginary. A figment that I hope is convincing, and not a kind of delivery vehicle for themes and ideas. When I heard the topic for this session, the image of the prison in the public mind, my first thought was that that image is usually distorted or false, but I was forgetting the part of the public for whom prison is not an image, but a first-hand reality. Perhaps what a novel can do is at least connect these two publics in a single story. I'm going to try to flesh out another empty abstraction now, which is that prison, that place of violence, has also been shown to me to be a sacred space, like all other spaces. A little tiny bit more of fiction. It'll be pain-free, I think. This is an email Jesse writes to Christopher Bell later in the book. I understand why you would want to go to Mexico, he wrote. It's Trump time, by the way, this book takes place. I mean, go there to stay. It got me thinking about how when I got out of here, I'll face a totally different world. When I first came to prison, there were no cell phones, no Facebook, barely even any internet. Guys come out of this place and can't figure out how to buy a toothbrush, I'm told. There's too many choices, or we have to order it online. A foreign country is what I'm talking about. Like you in Mexico. I'm going to try to keep 1 foot in and 1 foot out. You know what I'm saying? To not forget where I came from. It's like when I got to the end of the book of Exodus in the Bible, and there's a lot of drama going on. Moses brings down the 10 Commandments. They're about to cross over into the Promised Land, enemy territory. It's really a war is about to set off. And then they stop everything right there, and there's maybe 5 chapters just telling you how they built the tabernacle, this movable temple with the ark inside it, what kind of architecture there was, what kind of columns they used, the different stones and the types of wood, the ornamentation. They tell you exactly how much gold and silver and bronze they used to build the gates and the doors and the hinges and the altar. Part of the ornamentation was badger skins and ram skins they dyed red. I remembered all this because I could really see it. They're trying to paint a picture, make you sit with it for a long time before the story moves forward. Take it in. The temple is movable. They're going to take it with them to the promised land, but what they don't realize is that they're already in the promised land. The actual arrival is just a matter of time. The whole book of Exodus just ends with this long description of the temple. This was how it looked. The end. And I was like, what the fuck? And then I realized why they did it that way. It's because it's not about some specific piece of land. It's about this other space that is everywhere. And I'm going to leave it there. I want to just say one thing now. I have a friend who published a book about 1.5 years ago now. His name is Quantus Conquest. His novel is called This Life. Quantus has a life sentence in Angola, is still in there. And any of you who are interested in hearing what fiction sounds like written from the pen of someone who is in prison, I really recommend that book. It's kind of a masterpiece. I really admire it. It's called This Life by Quantus Conquest. Thanks.
Commenting. Tracy.
All right. Is this working? Yeah. So since everyone else has already thanked the organizers and those of you for being here, I'm going to take the first opportunity to thank the speakers. So thank you very much. You might think that I might be dreading a little bit what I'm about to do, since I have just heard all of these for the first time, and I now have to say something, hopefully interesting, maybe profound and helpful to those of you sitting in the audience. Think about it, but I'm actually quite joyful about this task, because it was an incredible experience to hear all of you speak. And actually, having been here for the first session, I'm also going to attempt to draw some connections between the first panel and this one. So here it goes. So Judith starts out by talking about incarceration and visibility. And I think using the term visibility is an interesting one in the context of the subject of the conference, incarceration and imagination. What role does visibility play when we are engaged in the project of imagination? And so I want to use that frame, the idea of visibility, contrast it with the concept of what's not secret, which is also something that Judith said, and just sort of trouble the idea that visibility and not secret are equivalent, which I think Judith sort of suggested. I'm not saying that that's what you meant. That's just literally what you said. I wrote it down. And how the juxtaposition of those terms helps us to think about the project of imagination. So that's one frame. The second frame is something that Zachary offered. He asked the question, what can fiction do to address misrepresentation? And that made me think about the interaction between representation on the one hand and misrepresentation on the other in the context of visibility, right? I think there, what Bernard said in the last session is his offering, or maybe we'll call it a provocation, that we're all engaged in fiction. What does that have to do with visibility? On the one hand, representation, misrepresentation, and then this project of imagination. Okay, so that's the overall frame. And I'm going to take each presentation in turn, hopefully still being under time. So Elizabeth starts out with this idea of, she talks about the image of the prison in the public mind in the context of rebellion. And then the process of rebellions that she describes, I think, would immediately cause us to think about, what are we talking about when we say public? Obviously, there are lots of publics. I mean, for Elizabeth's subjects, she's, I think, talking about the public, parts of the public involved in rebellion itself, and these kids. And one of the things that immediately came to mind in listening to the details that Elizabeth was offering was a connection between the first session, and in particular, Joy's comments about fugitivity and marriage, where, Elizabeth gives us this incredibly vivid picture of teenagers. I don't even want to call them teenagers. I mean, as a 13-year-old, a teenager, like a child, right? They're babies, who are, in her terms, sacrificing their own freedom against the specter for them of imprison, so that they have an imaginary of what this is. Is it visible to them? Like, what is it that they see? To borrow another phrase that Zachary offered, is this a movie in their head, or is something else happening? But anyway, there's what their actual action of sacrificing their freedom, and I'm thinking about that next to the prison narratives that Joy was talking about that are excluded, these narratives of fugitivity. So the one question for you is just sort of, how do we think about these kids, engaged in that act in a context where in incarceration people are doing, is it opposite? I don't even know how to think about, fugitivity next to what they were doing, but I would invite you to think about that and talk about that. The next thing that Elizabeth talks about in her comment was, she's talking about maybe their imagination is about mass incarceration, and then you tell a story about removal of many young people from neighborhoods and places where, and I'm again quoting you, maybe this is my interpretation of it, removing and quelling activism, right? This activism, these rebellions are quite visible. I mean, visible in the regular, normal, everyday way we think of visibility. It's not an imagination, right? We see it, and if this quelling is removing people and putting them in prison that Judith tells us is not secret, right? But it's also not visible. Certainly not in the same way that rebellions are. I think there's a way in which the incarceration, even if people are still engaged in activism, it's obscuring the nature of the activism. I wonder if that's the link to fugitivity. I don't know, but maybe that's a jumping off place. And then the final thing that's I want to say in connection with the first panel is that there's a way in which the mass aggregates, they are not secret, not visible, but to make visible and legible, that kind of activity might require some kind of individuation, which, those of us on this panel were invited by Zachary to go to the website that he spoke about, which was incredibly compelling for me to read these, listen to these individual stories. And then I sat through the first panel and then I thought, am I supposed to think about these individual stories in the same way, as compelling in the same way, given, the comments that Caleb offered? I'm just not sure. So, question in there somewhere. Okay, for Echo, he is giving us this incredibly evocative concept of deputization, and I wish I could remember the name of the philosophy student at Harvard who actually brought this up at this conference that Echo and I were at. It was really it was really jarring and also generative. I think it's a really helpful concept, but here's a thing to think about, right? So we have you note the hue and cry, which creates a concept of deputization, which is in a sense pre-state or pre-modern state as we understand it, right? It's not regulatory, and here I'm connecting with a talk that I just gave, and it's certainly pre-regulated police power in the U.S. as we think about it. Maybe not the continental version. So we go from deputization to, here's a timeline, state creation. If we're going to call the beginning of the modern state, to use Bill Novak's formulation, sort of the New Deal. So now we're in the 1930s, 1940s. You say, well, of course, it's not that deputization goes away. It just becomes less visible. So there's that frame again, right? It's that it's not secret, or is it secret? How do we think about its visibility? And to the extent that it is visible today, of course, it's not the hue and cry so much as it's, do I want to call it an implicit deputization? So, permit Patty, by calling on the police, to police activity of folks, the black minister who is very kindly watering his neighbor's garden when the neighbor is on vacation, and when police are called in that case, the person calling the police, is that an implicit deputization that fits in with your model, or is that pushing your concept too far? Because I think one answer you might have is, well, I'm actually talking about their own use of violence and not calling upon the state. But then how do we think about that line? Again, I think the ways in which we think about line depends on ideas of visibility and how we think about what visibility means. Is it just something that we know, or is it something that we need to see? Is it the movie in our mind, right? And then for you, Zachary, what I thought was fascinating about the fiction you shared was how vivid the quotidian was. So, right, I just became a pescatarian and I'm hungry. So when you started talking about the fish sandwich, I was like, where is that fish sandwich? I could kind of smell it, actually. And so that starts to bring in other senses. So when we're talking about visibility, are we talking about something that we see? Or are we talking about other senses, which brought to mind for me this book I just picked up. I haven't read it yet, but it's by a journalist whose name is Ed Young, and it's something like the immense world of animal senses. So he talks about all of the things that humans miss because we can't see UV light, and our hearing is not as keen as my puppy's. And he talks about these insects and plants that vibrate on plant leaves, and if you could actually translate it into sound, you could actually hear a symphony. But all the little bugs, I guess, are feeling it in their feet or something. I don't know exactly how it works. Like I said, haven't finished the book yet. But the question is, when we're trying to come to conclusions about the role of visibility and imagination, would you maybe make an argument that what fiction does in, the vivid quotidian is to allow us to sort of push the boundaries of our senses, and then that's what's really required for imagination? And if so, then, visibility, just to start to come back to where I began, might not be the word we want to use. That's it. Thanks.
We have exchanges among ourselves, but we want to start by inviting any comments or questions from Caleb. We'll start with you. And please introduce yourself. And I think you need to scream a little bit. Oh, microphones are coming to you. So just reintroduce yourself as well.
Hi, Caleb Smith. Thanks for this really illuminating panel. I really appreciate it. I wanted to pick up, Tracy, on something you said about, you and I can pick up the individuation thing, but really about Echo's paper and the concept of deputization, which I found really valuable. And I do think this is one of the places where intellectual work can have some leverage, actually, is by introducing concepts that then just get picked up, and they condense a lot of thinking, and they have a life in the culture, and they allow people to name phenomena. But like Tracy, my specific question was about whether the state is the authorizer of deputization. If I think about January 6th, I think about the state as a threat to the felt deputization of the people there. If I think about what people think the Second Amendment is protecting them from, it's from state encroachment on their deputized power to do the kinds of things that you're describing. So I wondered if, and I think I do think there are moments of quite clear state authorization. If you see something, say something, is, is an example. But I wonder if something like, to me, it seems like in some of the cases you're talking about, it's something like the nation and a kind of white nationalism that's authorizing the deputization, which can actually then be turned against the state as being secular, multicultural, limiting on this kind of power. So I'm just, I also do think there's a kind of expectation of exoneration, that's built into it, so fair. But I just wanted to think about whether there's even a certain kind of more mystical or fascistic deputizing power at work here than the state as that is, because there's obviously a lot of, white nationalist anti-state sentiment of its own type.
So thank you for the question, Caleb. Thank you for the question. So this is, as many of you know, this is actually the really great moment when you have an idea, you think it has real shape, but you don't quite know it yet. Because after a year or so of defending an idea, you're just sort of like trying to survive, right? So this is fun because I really don't know the answer to your questions. I'm, in a way that perhaps is insufficiently protective, just thinking with you all. But here are a couple thoughts I do have. So I take your question as of a piece with Tracy's. When does the ability to cast your hand, right, wave power at people, become deputization, when after all it can be calling the police to do something that the police, to enforce essentially your social norms? I don't want this person barbecuing, or is it, as I was trying to, I think, encircle, when you feel authorized to use force yourself? So I'm going to just, so that I don't go on and on, I'm going to use 3 examples, say they're on a spectrum, but say I want deputization to pick out a particular end of the spectrum. So one example is self-defense, right? People feel authorized to use self-defense and use violence in self-defense. And it's a powerful authorization. Indeed, when you teach self-defense in criminal law, one of the really interesting things is it's hard to give a particular justification of self-defense, but nobody's willing to give it up. It's one of the most deeply felt moral claims that I can use violence to protect myself as against you. But I don't think that's deputization. People feel that as a kind of natural right. And that's interesting to me. I said 3 examples. I'm going to use 4 because you gave me one. The Second Amendment, I think, is something like that. It is a felt kind of natural right that some people, at least in the American psyche, in very few other places. And I think you're right. It is not, if you were to tell most people that self-defense is a state-granted right, they'd say no. Yeah. I mean, to the extent they think about it, they'd say, no, it's a state granted recognition of some deeper natural right. And I think that people who either deeply are committed to or fetishize the Second Amendment think of it something like that, right? January 6th is an interesting counterexample because I actually do think it's an example of deputization. One of the interesting things about the January 6th rioters is that they resist the phrase January 6th rioters, right? Indeed, the late breaking news of the subpoena of the former president is precisely because the claim is he misled these people in thinking they were deputized. These were not people who said something's gone wrong with the state, thus I'm overthrowing it. These are people who it is deeply important to them that they hold on to the claim that they're patriots because they were deputized. And my point is that there's something important about that. They wouldn't hold on to it so dearly if it weren't important. And then lastly, I want to say, I think that's the end of the spectrum I want to get to, when people feel authorized themselves to use their violence. And I want to say it's even different than self-defense. Again, it's a spectrum. One of the things that's difficult about many instances of violence on black people is that it's described as self-defense, and we know that the self-defense is deeply racially refracted, right? That the black man sneezed and thus self-defense. But what I want to say is that's what frightens people when it comes to racial violence. It's not just that you might be violent towards me, or you might want my wallet. That happens in the world. It's that you feel authorized to do so. And that's what I want to pick out that I think is on the further end of the spectrum.
Question in terms of language about the word, first of all, entitlement, but also I keep thinking gender and violence against women and the gender of the interaction as needing to be engaged as the authority to be violent against a person in your household. And how that form of entitlement plays, and whether you want to, deputizing may be a subset of an entitlement to engage, some of which could come from. There's obviously more we want to probe in trying to understand the parameters of the imagery and claim.
That's really helpful. I don't want to dominate this, but I would say that's really helpful because I think you might think, for example, that men dispensing violence against women 200 years ago was seen as both entitled and deputized. And now some men still think it's entitled, but I think very few men think it's deputized. Very few men would say, the state would authorize this any longer.
Unless we think of abortion, but let's go.
Very quickly, listening to Echo talk and then Caleb's response, I just couldn't help but contribute something minor. Thinking about deputization, I realized that reading Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields was the first time in my life when somebody explained to me so clearly what ideology is. And if I have their definition correct, ideology is not something that you memorize and then repeat. It has to be enacted over and over and over again to do its real work. So I was thinking, deputization is the enactment of ideology over and over again, regardless of the four types you just cited. What it's doing is spreading and reproducing itself. And I'm sorry, I live in Los Angeles, but the president of our city council, Neri Martinez, said on tape, which was reproduced on Reddit, that her fellow councilman, Mike Bonins, I'm sorry, it's very disturbing, his adopted black son, she said if she needed to be able to take him around the corner and beat his ass. We're talking about a 2-year-old child. I'm sorry, this is very, very disturbing, but it is, I think, the reproduction of ideology in her self-deputization casually in that moment. And so she's even calling upon an imaginary space where people are continuing to do this kind of work. I was thinking maybe in a way, does it relate to Elizabeth Hinton's wonderful piece about the protest movement? Are we also why do we have to go out in the streets over and over and over again every time we witness state-sanctioned violence? Is it also our work to reproduce a counter ideology?
Obviously, I want to learn Elizabeth, but I just first of all, thank you for that. I just want to add one smallest of corrections: is that Jacob, his son, is actually 8 now, and I know this because Mike and Sean are actually friends of mine, And
Oh, why they keep saying that he was 2 or 3 years old, and this was a year ago.
so they're friends of mine actually, and so I've had to live. I mean, I don't pretend it, but it's been painful to be in touch with them. I remember when they adopted Jacob, and I played with Jacob in their backyard, and that kid is loved. So.
Thank you for the question. And I think in some ways it relates to the points that Tracy was making about fugitivity. Unfortunately, I was unable to hear Professor James's remarks, but I couldn't make it to the morning panel. But I think, the example of the kids, I mean, in this, right, they literally allowed, the kids in Baltimore, allowed the suspects who were being arrested to become fugitives, right? I mean, I think, and that's in some ways the point that I ended on. As long as we have violence sanctioned by the state has a monopoly on violence, and with that, the people white people in particular are deputized to enact violence. And I think, in response to Caleb's point, and also thinking about deputization and January 6th, it's about white supremacy, white supremacist ideology that is slippery in terms of its ties to the state. So when Donald Trump, tells people come to the Capitol, it's going to be wild, storm the Capitol. That's that sanctioned white supremacist violence, which has always been part of the American state. But as long as we're continuing to live in this where some groups of people are fugitives, some groups of people are captive, then it is, the responsibility and a natural response of those conditions to contest them. I mean, one of the big things, I didn't get into it in this talk, but, of the book America on Fire, from which I draw in this work, is that violence precipitates violence. It's a cycle of violence, of state-sanctioned violence, and then community violence, insurgency and counterinsurgency that we've been stuck in because of our economic systems, our ideologies, etc.
We started a couple minutes late, so I'm going to invade lunch a teeny bit and invite. And I think the way to do it is there are a few hands up. So we're going to take the hands that are up and listen to you, and then everybody will get their closing comments in relationship to you and otherwise. And the people with microphones are better at me than running around. Please introduce yourselves, but please put your hand up high, and so we can grab all your comments and then have a response. Go ahead, start. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rich Villar. I'm with the prison education program at NYU, and I want to say thank you for this entire day, really. I am one of the coordinators there. I do reentry work, and I'm also a poet. And indeed, I'm a poet that is steeped in a lot of those traditions that came out of those rebellions that were spoken of so eloquently during the 60s and 70s. And as such, our literature, Nuyorican literature, Black arts movement, Black nationalism, a lot of that stuff is informed by writers who were formerly incarcerated. And one thing I haven't heard yet, unless I missed it, is the literary imagination from that liminal space, right? From the space that is not incarcerated, but who is kind of bringing the experience of trauma. And I do social work, right? So trauma is always part of that. The experience of trauma and the time lost into a world that has in large part moved on or moved away or moved in different directions. So I'm curious, in any of your readings, if you've come across, and we're going to hear from formerly incarcerated writers later, which is awesome. But my question to you is about the theory behind it and some of the thinking that maybe some folks have put on paper around writing from that space. And I'm curious if any of your readings you've come across, and this could mean centuries ago, I don't know, of writers who are talking about that process. And I wonder if there might be a recommendation for a reading or two for someone who has students who are writing from there.
I think there's another person here, yes.
Hi, my name is Sonali Chakravarti. I'm from Wesleyan University, and my research is about juries, which are a very specific type of public whose imagination of prisons and of defendants carries a lot of weight. And I'm curious if the panelists feel that there might be any movement in the way jurors in this country understand the different aspects of this story. And in addition to, there's a huge need to have more racially diverse juries, certainly, but I'm just also curious if you see the possibilities of a change in the imagination of jurors.
I think there were a couple other hands over here. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, please. Will be geographic.
Are you sure?
No,
no, please.
Are
All right.
eager to hear.
So mine was kind of related to the, and thank you, Professor Hinton. But I'm Nasser, Yale undergrad. So I guess my question, it was kind of thinking with the January 6th riots. So I remember so I was actually in my APUSH class, and we were like watching it live, and we saw like the gallows with for Mike Pence, and I was thinking too, they the same people who were motivated on that day had the gallows for Obama, and actually putting like dolls of him being hung. And I guess you refer to like him as a black king, a secular king. I thought that was interesting, and like I guess I'm just trying to think out loud here. So it was Obama. He was like in Indonesia. He was going to the madrasas, the Islamic schools. He's Kenyan. He has a Muslim middle name, and he's the head of a white government. And that must have caused confusion for people who were, as you were saying, being sanctified to use this violence. And I guess maybe they felt betrayed by Mike Pence, and that Mike Pence deserved the same punishment as someone who was black. But Obama might not be like African American. He's like an Eastern black, and I want to see how that confusion led to the same, result of anger and punishment through such a very American violent way of punishment, which is the lynching. So that was what I was wondering.
There were hands from the back, at least two or one. I can't.
I think there's two. So thank you for everything.
Scream a little bit. It's a little hard.
Okay, you can hear me now. So thanks to the
Fancy
panel.
room doesn't have perfect acoustics.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could say more about the distinction between self-defense and violence. I know seminarians who created nonprofits in New York City around domestic violence, intimate violence, and the statement, along with some Buddhists, is you can use force against violence, but force is not a synonym for violence. So then self-defense has a distinct category.
I think there's one more hand there. Yes, please.
Hi, Andrew Clark from UConn. I'm interested in the concept of punishment. And Judith, in your initial slides, when you talked about prison, there's a lot of punishment that's in there. And then the idea, Elizabeth, that you talked about, the crucible period and the hyper-incarceration, which infused punishment even more into the carceral space. And then the idea of deputizing and who gets deputized to punish within prison, and then going to the fiction narrative of how can we change this. And when we're looking at other countries that don't view prison as a punishment scheme, but see as the taking away of liberty as punishment, and the role of a prison guard or correction system is actually rehabilitation, is there a way to change that narrative from someone that's been deputized to punish to be deputized to actually help?
Well, Tracy, do you want to go? Let's be geographic and go back. Everybody who has any comments, everybody, whether intersecting with these questions or the exchange among the panels, if we go back this way.
I don't have any answers
You
to
don't have
those
to have answers,
questions.
but you can respond to any of the comments you
kind of
like.
your work now.
Is it?
Maybe
I don't know. I have to think about it more.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Zachary.
There's
I know there's a lot out there, so you get
There's
to
a lot out
select
there.
something.
Yeah.
I think
Pursue.
the aperçu. I think we've been talking a lot about language. Actually, I think we've been talking about I can't remember what Joy's point was just now about distinguishing violence and force. Using the word deputization to pinpoint a number of things with one word. And I think what I'd like to say about that is pretty simple. That I think that we live in a culture in which we're bombarded with images. And I think language is one way to resist that and to get past that. And I think, you said something interesting about senses in general, and I was just reading this book about Jewish mysticism, and it's talking about how there's a difference between wisdom and understanding, and that wisdom is a flash of knowledge. It's God is sending some sort of energy that gives you this flash of knowledge, which is sort of, I guess, like intuition, and then past that is understanding, which is when you take that flash and you analyze it and particularize it. And I think that's considered the next phase. That's a higher phase than wisdom, actually, understanding. I think that's what language is helping us to do, and I think that that's what this symposium and things like it are useful in doing.
I've been given a lot of time, so I won't take too much more. First of all, thank you for your wonderful work. I don't know a lot about people who've written inside, but Dr. James has a set of anthologies, which I just became aware of. So you might want to speak to her or just Google her and buy everything she's written. Also an idea. I'm planning on doing so. I should say Professor and Dr. James. But there's been so much offered. I just want to say, Elizabeth, I love this question of the kids fighting in Baltimore, allowing others to become fugitives. Sonali, you know how much I appreciate your work on juries. I really want to think about that. I actually think that's a really important one in the way in which, so when I teach criminal law, there are just a lot of stories about the disconnect between jurors, in particular when the juries are not racially diverse. And now you're starting to see that change. You pointed out there's something odd about the Rodney King video. Mm-hmm. The analogy I always make is, if you finally believed your wife after she complained for years about her boss because you saw the video, your relationship would have both taken a step forward and a step back, right? Because it's sort of like, well, I complained to you since time in memoriam, and you had to see the video. So I think it's complicated. On the Obama point, I think it's a great point. Thank you for that. What I want to say is something like, I think you can be patriotic without thinking you're authorized. So you can be a patriot of a lost state, for example. There are people who thought they were fighting for the state that was taken away from them. And there are people who think they're authorized by the current state, and I want to disentangle that. And likewise, I want to disentangle self-defense versus violence along the same lines. I think self-defense comes closer to the idea of force, the idea that it's an innate authorization, whereas violence is more what I'm pointing at, deputization. I'll stop there. Thank you all for your comments. They've been tremendous.
Yeah. This has been a really enriching conversation. So I want to thank my fellow panelists once again, and all of you for your really thought-provoking questions. I guess just picking up on the last one in terms of trying to end maybe on a hopeful note, thinking about what help might look like, how we can reframe some of these things. It picks up on my last comment in the sense, we know what the solutions are. I mean, that's, the people who felt like they had no other recourse but to enact various forms of violence against the state knew that the solution was resources into under-resourced communities and jobs and better schools and a redistribution. The Kerner Commission in '68 says all of this, right? And so, I mean, I think that's why the questions of this conference are so interesting, because in order to actually, bring about the kind of form of governance that would be necessary to do that, which is, what I think defund is really all about, calling for a different approach to governance, given that these punitive strategies have failed to actually keep communities safe. How are we going to then, move the public imagination to be able to not other people, to de-link people of color, Black people, from ideas about criminality, and to make more visible, perhaps, in order to raise that awareness, these underlying problems and the failed policies. So, in a lot of ways, that's the task before us. But the imagination is so key within that.
So that you raise, I mean, I think this worlds of language and act is and thinking what these meanings and sensory experiences are. And there's this idea of the sovereign, whether the deputy is the quasi-sovereign or the self-understood sovereign in the household, and the non-sovereign. And the underlying question is, what can we do to each other in what level of authority? And there are some things that have been debated, like whipping or starving, that for some social orders we take off the table. It doesn't that it isn't happening, it's that we don't say it's authorized. We disavow that authority. And the current struggle is, what do we disavow and what do we refund, as well as what do we defund? And it's been incredibly moving participating in a conversation with you all around these incredibly weighty topics in a scary time. I think I'm supposed to announce, or actually better yet, well, we want to first of all thank Diane, and also I want to thank, you've been incredibly logistically engaged, and in terms of when you were saying things just happen, things don't just happen, they happen because people work hard at making them happen. So I think we all need to pause to thank you.